Hello, good evening everyone. Today we will be discussing joint and solidary obligation. So for your information, if you have already opened your book, you can see there are different kinds of obligations, but I am only discussing to you the most common kind of obligation. And one of the most common kind of obligation is the so-called joint and solidary obligation. Common kaayo ni siya kung mangutang mo og kwarta sa usa ka tao. From the picture itself, you will see that there is a difference between joint and solidary obligation. Remember, pag joint, isa-isa. Pag solidary, hawak kamay kayong lahat. You also have to remember the difference between joint and solidary obligation. Very simple. When you think about joint obligation, ang isipin ninyo to each his own. While when you think about solidary obligation, isipin nyo rin one for all for one. Pag joint obligation, to each his own. Isa-isa. Pag solidary obligation, utang sa isa, utang sa tanan. Let us start. Joint and solidary obligations. Article 1207 of the Civil Code provides that the concurrence of two or more creditors or two or more debtors in one and the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has a right to demand or that each one of the latter is bound to render entire compliance with a prestation. There is a solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Ma'am, lisudaan ni ma'am ako kasabot. Do not worry because I will explain this article later on. Another article is Article 1208. It says that if from the law or the nature or the wording of the obligation to which the preceding article refers the contrary does not appear, the credit or debt shall be presumed to be divided into as many equal shares as there are creditors or debtors, the credits or debts being considered distinct from one another, subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suits. Atoan ni siyang isa-isahon. Karon atong i-discuss ang kinds of obligation according to the number of parties. Remember guys, usahay tulo mo kabuok mangutang dito sa isa ka tao. Usahay pod isa ka tao iyang giutangan tulo ka tao. So mo ni siyang kinds of obligation according to number of parties. First one is the individual obligation and the second one is the collective obligation. Unsa man ang individual obligation, there is only one obligor or one obligee. Isa lang ang nangutang, isa lang ang giutangan. Who is the person entitled to demand payment? Of course, isa lang ang kadtong imong giutangan. Kinsa kamo bayad dito sa imong giutangan, kinsa imong paninglan dito ra pod sa isa ka obligee or obligor ba nga nagkadaiya. What is collective obligation? One where there are two or more debtors o pwede pod two or more creditors. Pwede pod isa ka debtor, tulo ka creditor. Pwede pod tulo ka debtor sa isa ka creditor. Lahi-lahi sila. Daghan ang creditor, daghan pod ang debtor. Under collective obligation, na kita ginatawag nga joint obligation ug naapoy solidary obligation. Unsa man ang joint, unsa ang solidary, malibog ta pero isa lang ang sure. Pwede nga duha ang debtor, duha ang creditor. Pwede nga isa ang debtor, duha ang creditor. Pwede nga duha ang debtor, isa ang creditor. Ang buot pasabot lang sa collective obligation is daghang party ang involved. Unlike sa individual obligation, isa ra gyud na ka obligor, isa ra gyud na ka obligee. Now, remember, there are two different kinds of collective obligation. We have joint and solidary obligation. Adto ta sa individual obligation usa. Remember, there is only one obligor and one obligee. For example, naa si A and naapod si B. Kung si A nangutang ngadto kang B og 90k, there is no problem with the determination as to who is the person liable, si A. Who is the person entitled to demand payment? Si B. Ingon ana kadali ang individual obligation. Now, let us go to collective obligation. Adto ta sa joint obligation. For example, naay na maligya og prutas. Karon, kini si A ug si B gusto mo palit og prutas. Ingon sila, tara, mamalit ta didtog upat ka apple. Duha ako duha pud imuha B. Sabay sila ni adto na sila'y kontrata. Sa ilang contract, ang ibutang didto proportionately tamamayad sa atong apol, or joint simply tamubayad sa atong apol, or mankumunda tamubayad sa atong apol, prorata tamubayad sa atong apol, o we promise to pay the apple. Mao nay nasa ilang kontrata. Duha sila guys, dungan ni adto sa namaligyag apple, kay mokuha sila upat ka apple. Duha kang A, duha kang B. What is joint obligation? Joint obligation occurs when the whole obligation to be fulfilled must be proportionate by the different debtors and or demanded proportionately by different creditors. Kung joint obligation, the debt is divided into as many equal shares as there are creditors or debtors. So for example, sa atong apple, duha man kabuk ang nangutang og apple, si A ug si B, pila ka apple? Upat ka apple. Therefore, ang upat ka apple must be proportionately divided between A and B. Since there are 4 apples divided by 2, duha ka apple kang A, duha ka apple kang B. Another thing, the debts are considered distinct from each other. Yes, dunga nanguha si A ug B ug apple, pero ilang utang distinct from each other. Each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of the debt and each creditor to his proportionate share of the credit. Since duha ka apple ang gikaon ni A, duha pod ka apple ang gikaon ni B, lahi-lahi nilang bayaran ang ilang apple ngadto sa namaligya. What if walay kontrata si A ug si B? When 2 or more creditors or 2 or more debtors concur in one and the same obligation, the presumption is joint. So kung nangutang mo pero wala mo'y kontrata, automatic ang inyong obligation is joint. Unsay pasabot sa joint? To each his own. Ang utang is divided by 2, divided by A, divided by B. Kung walay kontrata, unsa ingon, the presumption is joint. Lahi-lahi mog utang divided proportionately as to as many creditors and as many debtors. What then are the consequences of a joint obligation? First, each debtor is liable for a proportionate part of the entire debt. Second, each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate share of the credit. Third, the demand of one creditor upon one debtor produces default only as between them. Fourth, insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-debtor. And lastly, delay on the part of one of the debtors does not affect others. Ma'am, libuga na ma'am perting daghan na. Don't worry, I will explain one by one. Let us start. The first consequence of a joint obligation, each debtor is liable for a proportionate part of the entire debt. Proportionate part lang ang imong bayaran. For example, atong creditor mo ni siya, atong debtor kini sa pikas, pila ka buok atong creditor? Isa. Atong debtors pila ka buok? 3. Kining mga debtors karon nanghiram og kwarta ngadto sa creditor. Pila ilang gihiram? 90,000. Unsay giingon, each debtor is liable for a proportionate part of the entire debt. Since proportionate man ang atong giingon, kung moingon si creditor, guys, maningil ko sa inyong utang nga 90,000, pila-pila ilang share, proportionate part lang of the entire debt. Therefore, 90,000 divided by 3 is 30,000 kang red, 30,000 kang blue, and 30,000 kang green. The entire debt, again, pila? 90,000. It must be proportionately divided into 3 kay tuluman ang nangutang. 30k kang red, 30k kang blue, o 30k kang green. Again, each debtor is liable for a proportionate part of the entire debt. Usbo na to, what are the consequences of a joint obligation? Each debtor is liable for a proportionate part of the entire debt. Each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate share of the credit. Demand of one creditor upon one debtor produces default only as between them. Insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-debtor. And lastly, delay on part of one of the debtors does not affect others. Let us now go to the second consequence. Each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate share of the credit. So for example, natay creditor, natay debtor. What if ang ato ang creditor is 3 ka buok? Daghan sila kwarta. Ang nangutang isa lang ka buok si Red. Now what happens? Kung nangutang ni si Red og 90k sa 3 ka creditor, Unya, ang tulo ka creditor niingon og dong, maningil na mi sa imong utang dong. Unsaon pag-divide? Mobayad si Red og 30k ngadto kay creditor 1, mobayad si Red og 30k ngadto kang creditor number 2, ug mobayad si Red og 30k ngadto kang creditor number 3. Mao ni ginaingon nga each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate share of the credit. Pila gani ang entire utang? 90k. So ang proportionate share of each creditor is only 30k. Basahon na tog utrong mga consequences para di mo makalimot. Each debtor is liable for a proportionate part of the entire debt. Each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate share of the credit. Demand of one creditor upon one debtor produces default only as between them. Insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-debtor, and delay on the part of one of the debtors does not affect the others. Let us now go to the third one. Demand of one creditor upon one debtor produces default only as between them. Say for example, ang nangutang 3 ka buok, ang ilang giutangan 1 ka buok. Pila ang ilang giutang? 90k kano sa bayaran payable in April 21. Demand of one creditor upon one debtor produces default only as between them. Say for example, niingon si creditor, Red, maningil ko nimo. Okay? So pila gani ang dapat bayaran ni Red? 30,000. Apan hingingon si Red, "Hoy, wa ko'y kwarta oy." Unsa man na? Kinsa ang nagdemand si creditor, kang kinsa siya naningil kay Red. Apan niingon si Red, "Wala ko'y kwarta oy." Unsa gani ang consequence? Demand of one creditor upon one debtor produces default only as between them. Now, question, who is in default? Diba proportionate share man si red, blue o green? 30k kang red, 30k kang blue, 30k kang green. Karon ang gipaningil ni creditor is si red man. Ingon si red, wala ko'y kwarta. Who is in default? Si red lang ang in default. Walay appeal si blue o si green. Kay tungod, ang iyang gipaninglan si red man lang. The demand of one creditor upon one debtor produces only default as between them. So, ang default lang is si red. Kay siya raman ang gipaninglan. Let us now go to the other consequences. The fourth one, which is insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-debtor. Sa insolvency, what if ang isa ka debtor dili kabayad, siya lang ang insolvent, walay appeal ang uban? For example, aduna kitay creditor, aduna pud kitay debtor. Ang giutang sa mga debtor is 90k kano sa bayaran payable in April 21. Karon, ning ingon na si creditor, "Guys, maningil ko." Unsa ingon ni Red? "Huy, wa ko'y kwarta oy." Remember, insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-creditor. Pila gani ang utang nila tigi-isa? Since 90k, it's 30,000. Since ning ingon ni si creditor, "Guys, maningil ko," ingon si Red, "Hoy, wa ko'y kwarta oy." Ang iyang bayaron lang is 30,000. Karon hingingon si blue ug si green, "Ay, mubayad mi." Who is insolvent? Si Red lang ang insolvent. Si blue ug si green pwede sila mo bayad. Karon hingingon si creditor, "Aw, tapli sa ninyo si Red kay naman may kwarta makabayad man di ay mo." Pwede ba na? Always remember, insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-debtor. Remember kinsa ang insolvency? Red ra. Therefore, pwede ba nga taplan ni blue ug ni green si Red? The answer is no. Insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-debtor. Since si Red dili makabayad, magpabilin ra gihapon nga 30,000 ra ang obligation ni blue ug ni green ngadto kang creditor. Timan ina ha. Insolvency of a debtor will not increase the liability of his co-debtor. Dirita sa last one. Delay on part of one of the debtors does not affect others. Again, for example, aduna kitay creditor, aduna pud kitay debtors. Ang utang nila karon ni red, blue ug green is 90k with interest payable in April 21. Now, ingon si creditor, "Guys, maningil ko." Ingon si red, "Hoy, wa ko'y kwarta oy." Pila ra gani ilang responsibility? 30k each. Hingingon ni si blue ug si green, "Mubayad mi." Who is in delay? Kinsa naman ang di kabayad? Si red ra. Karon, muingon ni si creditor, "Na, bayrin ninyo ng tulo ang interest ni red." Pwede ba na? The answer is Still no. Why? Kinsa ang in delay? Si red ra. Delay on the part of the debtors does not affect the others. So kinsa ra ang mobayad sa interest nga 30K nga di pa kabayad karon? Si red. Si blue ug si green impas na sa ilahang utang. Delay on part of one of the debtors does not affect others. Again, let us review unsa gani ang joint obligation kanya-kanya. Kung ang inyong gikuha upat ka apples, i-divide ninyo na siya proportionately, 2 apples kang A, 2 apples kang B. Makabalo mo guys nga ang obligation is joint. Kung makit-an ninyo ni nga mga words, proportionately, joint simply, mancomunada, pro rata, ug we promise to pay. Kung makit-an ninyo ni nga mga words sa contract, it means ang ilang obligation is joint. Unsa gani ang joint obligation? It must be proportionately shared by different debtors ug ang makadiman proportionately rapod by different creditors. The debt is divided into as many equal shares as there are creditors or debtors. Kung nangutang mo og 125K, tulo mo kabuok 125K divided by 3. Dili pwede mo tubos, dili pwede taplan, mo na joint obligation. The debts are considered distinct from one another. Kung si A di kabayad, si A ra ang mobayad sa interest, walay labot si B. That is joint obligation. Each debtor is liable only for the proportionate part of the debt, and each creditor to his proportionate share of the credit. Unsay timan-an nato kung joint obligation? To each his own. Kanya-kanya.